Have you ever experienced something so unreal that it makes you question everything you thought you knew? Imagine a blizzard outside, the world buried under snow, and a presence at your door that defies explanation. One knock changes reality, and suddenly the rules you lived by no longer apply. Shadows stretch differently, time bends, and your own mind begins to betray you. This is the story of the night I let an alien stay in my cabin, and the reason it chose me still scares me. What followed was a journey beyond perception, beyond fear, where every instinct, every memory, every moment was rewritten. If you feel the pull of curiosity, stay with me, watch closely, listen carefully, and notice where you are as you watch this unfold. Share this story, subscribe to follow the journey, and comment below where you're listening from, because this isn't just my experience, it's one you might feel too. Step into the cabin with me and feel the instant everything you know shatter as the impossible storms through the veil of the ordinary. The wind tore against the walls of the cabin, rattling the windows as if it wanted inside. Snow pressed against the wooden siding in waves, each gust reshaping the world beyond the glass. Ethan Walker had been here many times, alone, but never had it felt like this. The air was thick with tension, or maybe it was the stillness beneath the storm, a quiet that should not exist when the forest was alive with wind and snow. He watched through the frost-lined window as flickers of light appeared between the trees. At first, he thought it was his imagination, the reflection of the lantern inside, bouncing against the glass. But the flashes persisted, uneven, deliberate, moving in patterns that made no sense. Like a language written in light he could not read. Time stretched. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. The storm obscured the horizon, obliterating any sense of distance. Everything outside was monochrome, white and gray, but the lights pierced through, unnatural, alien. They pulsed faintly, each burst slower than the last, as if breathing. Ethan tried to rationalize it. Wildlife, distant vehicles, reflections of the moon on ice. Nothing fit. He had counted every tree on this stretch of land, every ridge and hollow, yet these lights moved without regard for the landscape, appearing where there should be nothing. The cabin itself felt smaller, more fragile. Each creak of the floorboards echoed too loudly. Each gust of wind through the chimney carried a weight, a pressure he could not place. The storm was a wall, separating him from the world, and the lights were on the other side, observing, waiting. A sense of presence grew beneath the awareness of his own heartbeat, a knowing that he was not alone even if no one stood beside him. The isolation became oppressive, yet he could not leave the window, could not look away from the forest where the lights paused, disappeared, and returned as if marking some invisible pattern. He realized he had stopped breathing for moments, his chest tight, eyes fixed on the flickering. It was a warning or an invitation, and the line between the two blurred. Nothing about the night was ordinary. The storm, the cabin, the lights, even the snow itself carried a weight beyond comprehension. Ethan felt it in his bones, in the quiet between gusts, in the space where the wind could not reach. Something waited, and for the first time, he understood that the winter had not trapped him. Something had guided him here. The knock came softly at first, 3 taps almost hidden beneath the roar of the storm. Ethan Walker froze, his hands trembling on the edge of the table, eyes fixed on the door. The sound should have been ordinary, insignificant, a trick of the wind or the cabin settling. But it was deliberate, precise. Something in the rhythm pulled at his attention, as if the storm itself had delivered a message he could not ignore. The flickering lights outside faded when he moved toward the door, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat in the cabin. He hesitated. The temperature dropped suddenly, not from the wind, but from something else. Awareness, focus, pressure. Something was waiting beyond the door, something aware of him in a way no human could be. And then he saw it through the frosted glass, a tall figure, impossibly thin, pale as if carved from ice, standing perfectly still. Its eyes, or what passed for eyes, reflected no light, no warmth, but seemed to pierce into the room and into him. Ethan wanted to step back, to lock the door, to hide. Yet every movement felt measured, predestined. The knocking repeated, softer now, but still certain. It was not a demand. It was a presence communicating, pressing itself into his mind without words, yet with a clarity that left no ambiguity. The figure waited. He understood, not with thought, but with knowing. It was not a choice. The storm and isolation had nothing to do with it. It had found him. Ethan's hand trembled as he turned the knob. The metal was cold, unnaturally cold, colder than the winter outside. He opened the door, and the figure stepped in without hesitation. No sound of boots on wood, no change to the storm's howl. The cabin felt smaller, the air denser, as if the room itself bent to accommodate its presence. Dendru did not speak. Its gaze swept the space, assessing, understanding, imprinting some invisible mark on everything it touched. Ethan tried to make sense of it, to rationalize. It was impossible. It was here, in his cabin, and yet it was not here, in any way he could define. Awareness flooded his mind, a presence pressing against the edges of comprehension, reshaping thought, memory, and fear into a single, unyielding certainty. He was not in control. He had not invited it. And yet, he had. The room trembled subtly. And Ethan knew, even before he realized it, that nothing in his life had prepared him for this. The first hours with Dendru were measured, deliberate. Ethan Walker could feel the weight of its presence everywhere, pressing gently against thought and perception, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply aware. The air inside the cabin shifted as if it had been breathed in and out by something larger than the room itself. He tried to move, to speak, but found words meaningless. Thought, intention, and action seemed suddenly fragile, as if the cabin and its solitary occupant had been placed under a new set of rules, a quiet protocol he had not agreed to yet could not ignore. Dendru did not speak, it did not gesture. Its gaze swept across the space with precision, registering each object, each shadow, each imperfection. Then, with a subtle movement of its elongated hand, it directed attention to the devices in the room. Phones, laptop, and tablet lay untouched. Ethan felt an instinctive, uncontrollable urge to set them aside, to disconnect entirely. The thought was not his own, and yet it resonated with a clarity he could not argue against. Electronic signals, noise, contact with the outside world were forbidden. He did it without hesitation, placing each device neatly on the counter, unplugging cables, leaving nothing connected. Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was a presence layered into the room, filling space without sound. Ethan realized he could not leave the cabin, not in the ordinary sense. Even the thought of stepping outside carried weight, as if gravity itself had shifted to make him pause. His mind raced, trying to rationalize, to understand, to impose logic on the incomprehensible. Every instinct told him to flee, and every instinct told him to obey. Both were irrelevant. He was neither guest nor host in the traditional sense. The compulsion to comply extended beyond devices. Thoughts of sharing this encounter with anyone were suppressed automatically. Writing, speaking, even considering the possibility of telling another human felt impossible. It was not fear, not pressure, but recognition. He understood the consequences before they could occur, a premonition of rules enforced without violence, without sound. Time became irrelevant. Hours could have passed, or only minutes. Ethan's awareness sharpened, focused entirely on the cadence of Dendru's presence, on the unspoken boundaries that defined the space. Every movement, every breath, every thought was being recorded, observed, integrated into something larger he could not yet perceive. The room had become a chamber, a test, a crucible, and he understood with a sudden, chilling certainty that compliance was not a choice. It was survival. Ethan Walker moved through the cabin as though the space itself had changed. The furniture was in the same place, the stove, the table, the single bed. Yet the room felt alive, aware, as if each object were an extension of Dendru's presence. The alien did not occupy space in the way he understood. Its movements were precise, fluid, almost imperceptible, yet every gesture left a trace in the air. A subtle shift in temperature, a displacement of thought he could feel pressing against the back of his mind. He watched without seeing, listened without hearing, trying to understand rules that were not written but imposed through some unspoken gravity. Time had no measure. Ethan lost count of hours, or maybe days, and found it irrelevant. Each action became a study in observation, a test in patience. Dendru's silence was not empty. It conveyed meaning in the smallest of gestures, a tilt of the head, a pause, the angle of its fingers as they hovered near the stove or window. He could not decipher intent, but intent was there, inherent, undeniable, compelling him to reconsider his own motions, his own presence, as though he were part of a system far larger than the cabin, larger than the forest, larger than himself. The boundaries between the living and the inanimate blurred. Shadows moved slightly before he did. Sounds arrived just a fraction of a second early enough that his mind suspected precognition rather than perception. Ethan could not tell where Dendru ended and the cabin began. Was the alien observing him, or was he observing himself through the alien's awareness? The thought itself became slippery, a question without an answer. Each breath carried weight, as if consciousness were measured by something invisible, something that counted, recorded, stored. He touched objects to test reality. The table, cold and solid, yet impressions lingered, fleeting, like fingerprints left in the air. The fire flickered in response to nothing. Outside, the storm continued. But wind and snow behaved differently near the window, brushing around Dendru's form without touching it, bending in ways the laws of nature could not account for. Ethan questioned every memory, every certainty he had held. The room, the cabin, the forest, even his own body, felt like a projection, a simulation designed to test perception and endurance. He realized he no longer moved entirely by choice. Even thoughts seemed borrowed, filtered through some larger consciousness. The question arose unbidden. Was he still himself, or had he become part of something else, something vast and silent, watching, calculating, waiting for him to understand before he even knew the question existed? Time fractured inside the cabin, or perhaps it was Ethan Walker who had fractured. Hours stretched into something unmeasurable. Days folded over themselves, and nothing obeyed the rhythm he had once known. The clock on the wall ticked, but each second felt uneven, dragged, skipped, and stumbled like a broken pulse. He glanced at his wristwatch, then the tablet he had left untouched, and the readings contradicted each other. It was impossible. He had not slept, yet exhaustion had no meaning. Hunger arrived late, then too early, demanding attention in bursts that left him unbalanced. He tried to track the progression of light outside, but the storm had not relented. Shadows fell in impossible directions, and the forest beyond the cabin seemed to loop, branches and trunks repeating, as if the world itself had paused, waiting. Ethan's senses began to argue with one another. He could feel heat from the fire, but his skin registered cold. The roar of wind reached his ears, yet he could not locate its source. The flickering lights from the previous night returned, faintly, outside. But now they moved with a purpose, tracing paths between trees that did not match the terrain he had memorized. The sensation of missing time emerged first as unease, then as terror. He would step from one corner of the cabin to another and suddenly find hours had passed. Objects shifted positions without explanation. Utensils on the counter, blankets folded differently, footprints in the snow outside he could not account for. He did not leave, and yet he was not certain he had remained. Memory became unreliable, as though his mind could no longer anchor events to the linear flow he had trusted. Dendru remained silent, observing, its presence constant, unmoving yet infinitely aware. Ethan felt the alien's consciousness brush against his own, a reminder that he was not alone in this distorted chronology. The knowledge pressed at him, fragments of events he could not place, images of what might have occurred, and memories that seemed borrowed from someone else. Fear mixed with fascination, and he began to understand that the storm outside was not the force to reckon with. It was the manipulation of perception, the stretching and folding of reality, that threatened his understanding of self. By the time Ethan dared to check the clock again, the numbers made no sense. 21 hours past some arbitrary midnight, or had it been 3 hours since breakfast? He could not tell. He realized he had entered a different dimension of awareness, one where waiting and watching were the same, and the boundaries of his own existence had begun to dissolve. Time was no longer a measure, it was a presence. And it was patient. The moment arrived without warning. Ethan Walker sat near the stove, staring at the flickering flame, when the pressure began. It was not in the air, not a sound or a vibration, but in the hollow spaces of his mind. Thoughts he had not thought began to surface, images that belonged neither to memory nor imagination. And a presence, patient and insistent, brushed against the edges of awareness. And then it spoke, not with voice, not with words, but directly, as if the cabin itself had become a conduit. He tried to recoil, to shield himself, but the connection was complete before he understood it. Floods of images assaulted him, worlds of impossible scale, skies swirling with colors he could not name, landscapes that shifted beneath his gaze, oceans that glowed from within. He felt the pulse of life in forms he had never imagined, intelligence of a kind his brain could barely process, and all of it pressed into him without consent, without mercy. Each fragment carried emotion, overwhelming in its intensity, curiosity, sorrow, patience, calculation, and something older, something ancient, something aware of itself in ways beyond comprehension. Fear rose, but it was accompanied by clarity. He did not understand, and yet he understood. The knowledge was raw, intuitive, like touching a current of thought that had no beginning and no end. He could sense distance and time stretched and folded, civilizations rising and falling, stars igniting and dying, yet all focused in a single, coherent pattern he could feel but not describe. Every pulse of information left a residue in his mind, a trace of order and chaos, a resonance he could not unhear. Ethan's body trembled, heart racing, as the presence deepened. He realized the connection was not passive. Dendru did not merely send, it aligned itself with him, probing his understanding, testing the limits of perception, extending a hand into his consciousness, to guide, to shape, to reveal. And yet, even as comprehension expanded, the edges remained jagged. He could see, but could not hold, could understand, but not articulate. Each revelation vanished as quickly as it arrived, leaving only the imprint, the echo of knowing without language. When the mind link finally receded, Ethan sank to the floor, gasping. The room was unchanged, the storm continuing outside as if nothing had happened. And yet he knew it had. Something fundamental within him had shifted. A gate opened, a threshold crossed, and he could not return to the ignorance he had carried before. Dendru's presence lingered, patient, waiting for the next step. And Ethan understood that the first link was only the beginning. Ethan Walker noticed the first subtle shift while pouring water into his cup. The kettle was already on the counter, upright, yet he had left it on the stove minutes before. The water inside had not boiled, but the temperature was different, warmer, as if it had been heated elsewhere beyond his perception. He froze, hand hovering, staring at the mundane object as though it had betrayed him. Dendru stood across the room, still, expressionless, yet he could feel the presence acknowledging the anomaly without comment, as if the impossible were ordinary. Objects moved without cause. A chair slightly shifted when he turned away. A book fell, not onto the floor but onto the table, as though guided by invisible fingers. The small wooden box on the shelf, which he had examined twice that day, appeared open when he had been certain it was closed. Each time he glanced at Dendru, the alien did not react, did not offer guidance, did not warn. Its silence was deeper than sound, heavier than air. Yet it conveyed something unspoken, a rule he had not learned but could not ignore. Time and space inside the cabin began to behave differently. Shadows did not align with the single lamp, bending in directions he could not rationalize. Light from the storm outside seemed to arrive unevenly, brushing across the walls in pulses. The snow against the windows melted and froze in patterns he could not predict. Ethan's perception fractured, certainty dissolving into constant question. He reached for the kettle again, half expecting it to rise into the air. And it did not, but he did not trust that it would not next time. The strange occurrences were accompanied by a pressure in the mind, a persistent sense that the cabin itself was alive, responding, aware. Dendru moved among the objects, yet the movements were imperceptible, precise, silent, each step leaving an impression in the space that was almost memory, almost thought. Ethan realized he could not act independently. Every motion, every glance, every thought was subtly shifted by the presence. And yet he was allowed to believe he chose. By the time he sank onto the bed, exhaustion had no meaning. He understood that control was an illusion. The cabin, Dendru, and perhaps even he himself, were part of a continuum he could neither escape nor define. And the more he watched, the more he felt the shift expanding beyond perception, waiting for him to notice the patterns, waiting for him to see what had always been there. Ethan Walker froze the moment it happened. Dendru's gaze shifted, eyes or whatever functioned as eyes, locking onto him with an intensity that bypassed observation and went straight to recognition. And then the thought arrived. Not in sound, not in speech, but inside him. Insistent, undeniable. It was his name, but not the name he had been born with, not the name he had lived under for 37 years. It was older, deeper, resonating with something buried, something he had never known he remembered. The syllables pressed against his consciousness, folding into his mind as if they had always belonged there. Fear and fascination tangled, sharp and twisting. How could this entity, this being that had appeared from nowhere, know the name that felt like it belonged to another life? Ethan tried to shake the thought away, tried to dismiss it as projection, coincidence, hallucination, but the recognition was too profound. It was not surprise, not deduction, not something learned. It was acknowledgement. Dendru had known before he entered, before he opened the door, before he had even noticed the storm outside. The cabin felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls themselves leaned closer to witness his reaction. Snow fell endlessly outside, but he barely noticed. The storm reduced to white noise. Every instinct he had ever trusted, every protocol, every calculation, seemed suddenly irrelevant. The presence of Dendru was not merely in the room, it was in him, inside the corridors of memory, in the synapses and folds that had never been mapped. Questions rose, each one more impossible than the last. Why him? Why now? Why this name, this identity, this thread of self that was older than the life he thought he had lived? He could not remember, yet the echo of memory pressed against his understanding. The entity had chosen him deliberately. There was intention in every pause, in every gesture, in the silence between breaths. Something unseen, something beyond comprehension, had made the decision long before his awareness caught up. Ethan's heartbeat accelerated. The knowledge was not revealed, only suggested, hinted at in the patterns, in the recognition, in the certainty that had settled into his chest. He had not been chosen randomly. He had been found. And the realization came as both terror and revelation. The reason for Dendru's presence, for the contact, for every impossible shift, was connected to something within him, something he had never acknowledged, something that had waited patiently across time and space until this moment of awakening. Ethan Walker caught his reflection in the cracked surface of the cabin mirror and froze. The face staring back was familiar, yet it was not singular. Layers shifted beneath the skin, subtle distortions that were not physical but mental, echoes of consciousness stacked upon one another. Each blink revealed variations, slight changes in the eyes, the angle of the jaw, the tension of muscles. He had looked in mirrors 1,000 times, but never like this, never as though he were witnessing more than oneself at once. He leaned closer, searching for the origin of the sensation, but the reflection refused definition. It moved independently in small, almost imperceptible ways, as though some portion of his mind existed outside his control. Recognition mixed with terror, for he understood, in some instinctive, unspoken way, that the layers were not illusions. They were truths he had buried, fragments of existence he had never accessed, converging now under the weight of Dendru's presence. The alien sat silently across the room, still and patient. Yet Ethan could feel it observing every thought, every tremor of comprehension. Its awareness pressed against him, guiding, testing, revealing without revealing. He could sense Dendru's curiosity, the same recognition he had felt in the spoken name earlier, a knowledge that stretched beyond what he knew of himself. The realization struck with the subtlety of a pulse. He had always been more than a single identity, more than the man he had believed he was. The awareness had been waiting, hidden beneath the layers of habit and memory, for the moment he could perceive it. Time inside the cabin continued its uneven rhythm, yet moments of stillness allowed the overlapping selves to surface. Ethan's thoughts fractured, spun, and merged. He recalled distant memories that felt borrowed, feelings that were not his own, instincts that he could not trace. Each reflection in the mirror carried a whisper of something ancient, something patient, something that had observed him long before the storm, long before Dendru arrived. He stepped back, heart hammering, gaze shifting to the cabin walls, the ceiling, the snow outside. The world felt thinner, more pliable, as if reality itself were layered, and he had only begun to perceive the intersections. Identity, he realized, was no longer singular. It was a network of selves, some remembered, some forgotten, some yet to emerge, and the question arose, persistent, unanswerable. Which of these selves had been chosen, and why, and by whom? Ethan Walker followed Dendru through the cabin door and into the storm, and the world shifted immediately. Snow fell in patterns that made no sense, spiraling sideways, layering over itself as if gravity itself had forgotten its rules. The forest was alive in a way he had never perceived, trees bending and twisting in subtle, impossible ways, their branches forming arcs that should have collapsed under the weight, but did not. The light, pale and cold, refracted unnaturally, casting shadows that moved independently of the objects they should have followed. He could not tell where the source of illumination came from. It was everywhere and nowhere, bathing the landscape in a calm, alien glow. Each step he took sank into snow that resisted, then gave way as though testing him. Footprints formed and disappeared in seconds, erased by some unseen hand. The wind carried sound and carried none, brushing against him without displacing air. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the reach of vision, a presence lingered. It was not threatening, yet it was undeniable. A faint consciousness that observed with patience, as if measuring him, marking him. Ethan felt it press against the edges of his perception, and instinctively he stopped, heart racing, body rigid. Dendru moved ahead with the same fluid precision, each step calculated, silent, deliberate. Ethan's mind struggled to reconcile the impossibilities. No sound, no resistance. Yet each motion had weight and effect. Snowflakes seemed to curve around Dendru as he passed, creating ripples of movement in the air. Subtle, but perceptible. Ethan's gaze followed, trying to decipher the logic, and in doing so he noticed small anomalies. Trees reflecting angles that should have been impossible, shadows of animals that moved in delayed sequences, and a faint shimmer in the distance that suggested the presence of something alive, something waiting. The forest stretched in every direction, infinite and contained at once. He lost all sense of distance. A tree, he thought, 20 meters away became 10, then 30, then vanished entirely when he blinked. Time seemed to dilate and contract with each step. Ethan realized his own breath was not his own. The rhythm of inhalation and exhalation had shifted subtly, synchronized with the environment around him. It was as though he had stepped into a place that remembered him, that knew the cadence of his body before he acted. A subtle pressure pressed against his mind, the same sensation as the first telepathic contact, but now amplified. Dendru's presence was steady, guiding, and yet the forest itself pulsed with awareness. Ethan understood that this was not merely observation. He was being assessed, not physically, but as a being, as a consciousness. He felt the eyes of something distant, formless, patient, lingering in the periphery of thought. The snow and the light and the trees had become mediums, conduits for something beyond comprehension. Hours, perhaps minutes, passed or perhaps they did not. Every step was a test, every breath a measurement. Ethan realized that leaving the cabin had not brought him closer to reality. It had placed him on the threshold of something far older, far larger, and far more deliberate. The forest waited. Dendru waited. And somewhere beyond perception, he knew, the presence that observed would not allow him to forget what he had witnessed. Ethan Walker felt his mind stretch beyond the boundaries of his body, beyond the cabin, the snow, the storm, beyond the forest itself. Dendru's presence pressed against him again, not physically, but mentally, drawing him outward, widening perception, until he could feel the thrum of worlds he had never known existed. The first glimpse came without warning, an image that was more felt than seen. Cities suspended above oceans of glowing liquid, inhabited by beings whose forms shifted like smoke, yet who thought with the precision of a hive mind. He sensed the weight of their awareness, a consciousness layered upon consciousness, watching, recording, remembering. The vision shattered, fragmenting into chaos. Ethan's mind was assaulted by memories of civilizations that had burned themselves out, entire worlds collapsing under their own energy. Lives extinguished in flashes of awareness that lasted less than a heartbeat. He felt grief not his own, terror not his own, loss that spanned millennia. Each pulse of information was overwhelming, an ocean in which he could barely breathe, and yet he could not look away. Dendru's presence remained anchored beside him, steady, guiding, protective, but never intervening. He glimpsed others, observers like Dendru, scattered across the void, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of countless forms of life. Each carried their own awareness, their own methods of measurement, their own patience. Ethan realized that he had been part of a network, a lattice of consciousness that stretched across space and time, and that the selection of his cabin, his storm, his existence, was no accident. Something about him had registered, had resonated, had been recognized. The enormity of it terrified him. He felt as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice with no ground beneath him, only infinite awareness, infinite history, infinite observation. His thoughts splintered and recombined, struggling to contain the input, struggling to maintain a sense of self. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, he sensed a purpose, faint, flickering, like a distant star. He was chosen, but not for punishment, not for reward, not for trivial curiosity. He was chosen because of what he could become, what he could witness, what he could carry forward in understanding. Images collided with sensation. Skies aflame with auroras that hummed in geometric precision. Seas that reflected consciousness rather than light. Beings communicating through pure thought. Each word a vibration in the fabric of reality. He felt the fragility of life, the persistence of awareness, the slow accumulation of intelligence across untold eons. And beneath it all, a question pressed, urgent and unspoken. How would he reconcile the human experience with this incomprehensible vastness? Ethan collapsed to the snow, knees sinking into drifts that had become inconsequential in comparison. The storm raged, but it no longer mattered. The forest, the cabin, the light, the cold, all were threads in a larger pattern he was only beginning to perceive. Dendru's presence remained, calm and steady, an anchor in the expanding universe inside his mind. And as he lifted his gaze, he realized that the true challenge was not to survive the storm outside, but to survive the storm within. Ethan Walker struggled to speak, but words felt hollow in the cold, electric air of the cabin. He asked the question anyway, letting it form fully in his mind, allowing it to reach beyond the surface, beyond the usual constraints of conversation. Why me? Why here? Why now? The question echoed within him, a vibration that carried weight, urgency, and fear. Dendru did not answer in words, did not turn, did not even shift. The presence was steady, patient, waiting. The answer came not as language, but as sensation. A flood of certainty washed over Ethan, a knowing that bypassed logic and memory. It was not auditory, it was not visual, it was woven into his very consciousness. He understood immediately, instinctively, that he had been chosen because he could perceive without resistance, because he could endure without breaking, because he could carry the weight of awareness that most beings would shatter beneath. He had been selected not for skill, not for intellect, not for circumstance, but for capacity. Capacity to remember, to witness, and to integrate what most minds could not tolerate. He sank to the floor, pressed hands against the wood, trying to hold on to his own reality, even as the awareness expanded, layered upon layers of thought and sensation. He could feel the remnants of the visions he had glimpsed before, the cities suspended above alien oceans, the collapsed civilizations, the other observers. Each memory carried its own pulse, its own gravity, and he felt himself bending to accommodate it, a vessel of understanding forced into form. The sensation was overwhelming, yet steady, and within it, a strange calm settled, a calm deeper than fear or confusion. Dendru's gaze, if it could be called that, remained upon him, unblinking and infinite. There was no judgment, only observation, only the quiet acknowledgement that Ethan had understood. He could feel the resonance, the silent thread that connected him to something beyond the cabin, beyond the storm, beyond the snow, beyond the forest. The choice had not been made lightly. It had been made across dimensions he could not name, across time he could not measure. Ethan's mind, stretched and fragile, grasped at comprehension. He realized that choice, in this context, was not voluntary. It was recognition of latent ability, of endurance, of the capacity to integrate what could break others. He felt the pull of responsibility pressing, soft but insistent, a weight that was also a release. He had been chosen to witness, to remember, to survive the incomprehensible without losing the self entirely. He rose slowly, knees stiff in the snow, mind spinning with fragments and echoes. The storm around the cabin continued, yet it seemed diminished, smaller, trivial. Dendru did not move, yet the entire forest seemed aligned with him, responsive, aware. Ethan understood that the real journey had only begun. The question of choice had been answered not in words but in knowing, in acceptance, and in the quiet, unyielding understanding that he was ready for what was coming, even if he did not yet know what that would be. Night fell with a weight that felt different, as if the darkness carried substance, pressing against the cabin walls. Sleep no longer offered rest. It had become a threshold into something far more dangerous. Lying on the cot, the thin blanket barely warm against the chill, Ethan felt the familiar pull of the unseen. The air thickened around him, charged, as if the molecules themselves were conscious, waiting. Closing his eyes was no longer voluntary. It was inevitable. A surrender to a realm he could not control. The dream began immediately. Or perhaps it had never ended. He was walking through a forest he did not recognize, yet it was identical to the one outside the cabin. Snow fell sideways in silent sheets, forming spirals and tunnels in impossible symmetry. Trees stretched higher than human perception could accommodate, and the shadows they cast bent reality itself. The wind carried sound and carried none. Somewhere above, a light pulsed in perfect cadence with his heartbeat, illuminating patterns on the ground that were neither natural nor random. Voices spoke without forming sound. Faces appeared and vanished without warning. Eyes full of knowledge he could not comprehend. Voices spoke. He felt himself moving, yet he did not step. His body remained still in the cabin, but every nerve, every thought, every muscle was convinced he was walking miles through that alien terrain. Time fractured. Seconds stretched into hours, then collapsed into a single instant that carried the weight of centuries. The presence that haunted him outside the cabin now filled the dream entirely, pressing, observing, and testing, memories not his own interlaced with reality. Entire civilizations appeared and dissolved, their knowledge encoded in sensations and symbols, flooding his mind with visions of triumph and annihilation. It was impossible to separate what had happened from what would happen. The awareness was relentless, intimate, and entirely prescriptive. Each image, each emotion, each pulse carried meaning, though the meaning was not immediately clear. He could not shut it out, could not escape it, could not control it. The dream was no longer contained within sleep. It bled into consciousness, leaving traces, echoes, impressions that lingered when he awoke. When the eyes opened, the cabin was unchanged, the storm quiet, the snow resting like nothing had moved. And yet, the mind remembered everything. The smells, the sounds that were not sounds, the impossible geometry, the presence. It lingered at the edge of thought, unrelenting. Ethan could not trust the mind he had carried all his life. What was memory? What was dream? What was real? Each waking moment was layered with the residue of what he had witnessed while unconscious, leaving him uncertain, fragile, hyper-aware. Even Dendru remained silent, watching, waiting, patient as ever. The creature's presence no longer provided comfort. It was a reminder that the dream and reality were threads in the same pattern, woven together in a logic he could not yet decipher. Sleep was no longer refuge. It was the doorway, the test, the first lesson. and he had yet to understand its purpose or its cost. The first symbol appeared at dawn, etched faintly across the frost of the cabin window. It was neither drawn nor formed by natural frost patterns. The lines were deliberate, impossibly precise, vibrating subtly as though alive. Ethan's eyes traced the angles and curves, and for a moment the air itself seemed to hum. The snow outside, fresh and untouched hours before, now bore the same design, each imprint radiating a pulse that resonated with something deep inside him, a part of consciousness he had not yet learned to access. Dendru moved silently through the cabin, its form casting a shifting shadow that seemed to mirror the symbol's fluidity. The creature paused beside the largest etching, raising a slender appendage, pointing without gesture. Ethan felt the communication flow directly into his mind. Not words, not sound, but a wave of knowing. The symbol was meant to be seen, felt, internalized, but not explained. The unspoken instruction carried the weight of inevitability. Understanding would come not through logic, but through resonance. As hours passed, the symbols multiplied. They appeared across walls, emerging faintly from grain in the wood, curling upward like tendrils, then disappearing only to reappear moments later in slightly altered forms. The snow became a canvas, footprints weaving through shifting shapes, leaving patterns that should not have been possible. Every symbol pressed against his awareness, vibrating with a cadence that made thought itself ripple. Ethan's own hand shook as he reached toward one, unsure if touch would destroy it or complete it. The resonance was more than visual. It spoke to something latent, something buried beneath years of conditioned perception. Each line, each curve, each geometric impossibility stirred a memory or a recognition he could not place. His consciousness expanded, tugged outward by an invisible tether that Dendru held lightly but firmly. The forest outside mirrored the patterns inside the cabin. Snow-laden branches bore symbols in frost, and the pale light filtered through them like a coded signal. Time itself seemed to respond, slowing and stretching around the pulsing designs. By evening, the symbols began to coalesce into sequences, chains that made faint sense in a logic beyond human thought. Ethan understood that this was not decoration, not warning, not threat. It was instruction, though the method and purpose remained concealed. Dendru watched him, a silent partner in the transmission, neither demanding nor guiding with words. The presence of the alien seemed to anchor the patterns, to prevent them from slipping entirely into chaos. Sleep offered no reprieve. The symbols followed, appearing in his mind with unerring clarity, glowing against the darkness of his eyelids. Each pulse, each vibration, demanded acknowledgement. He understood instinctively that failure to perceive, to resonate, might have consequences he could not yet imagine. The world outside, the cabin, the forest, and even time itself had become a living script with the symbols as its language, and he had been chosen to read it. Movement became unavoidable. Ethan felt it first in his hands, a subtle tug beneath the skin, as though invisible strings guided each finger. He reached for his notebook, and without thought, without choice, the pen rose, tracing lines and curves that mirrored the symbols appearing in the frost and snow. His eyes followed automatically, but the mind that should have been directing him was silent, absent. The writing flowed faster than comprehension, each mark precise, deliberate, alive. When he tried to stop, the fingers refused, continued as though animated by a force outside himself. The compulsion extended beyond his hands. He felt it in his legs, a subtle pressure in the muscles, a whisper in the nerves, urging him to rise and walk. Standing brought no relief, only tension, the inevitability of motion. Doors opened without conscious permission. Steps carried him through the cabin and into the swirling snow outside. The forest stretched around him, blanketed in white, yet he was not afraid. Fear had no foothold here. It had been replaced by recognition, by the certainty that resistance was impossible. Each step was preordained, each path exact. The wind shifted as if it too had noticed his passage, bending the snow and branches in alignment with unseen grids. At times, he would glance at Dendru, the alien remaining still, observing with an intensity that did not demand explanation. The creature did not intervene, did not correct, did not encourage. It merely existed, a silent anchor in the storm of control and surrender. Yet, the awareness of Dendru's presence heightened the compulsion, deepened the pull. Ethan understood that the force animating him was not malevolent, it was purposeful. Every motion, every drawn symbol, every step outside carried intention. Though the meaning remained hidden, he was a conduit, a vessel channeling something far beyond comprehension. Hours blurred as action replaced thought. Eating became automatic, drinking, sitting, standing. Each moment was a rehearsal of obedience without command, execution without understanding. The forest and cabin transformed into extensions of a single organism, and he was both observer and participant. His own autonomy eroded into threads woven with unseen hands. Sleep was no longer an escape. The compulsion persisted even in dreams, carrying the patterns, the movements, the steps across landscapes that may not have existed yet felt more real than his waking life. By the third cycle of snow and darkness, a realization settled into the marrow of his bones. The compulsion was not punishment, it was selection. His body, once confined by choice and limitation, had become capable of extension, of interaction with realities and forces beyond human perception. Resistance would not liberate. Compliance offered insight, understanding, resonance. He was being trained in subtlety, in patience, in obedience to a rhythm older than memory itself. And yet, a flicker of thought remained, a silent question behind every motion. What was waiting at the end of this inevitability? And would he still be himself when it arrived? The revelation came not in words, not in sound, but as a current of knowing that threaded through Ethan's mind while he moved through the snow-laden forest. Dendru had always existed outside time as humans perceived it, yet fragments of memory, of history, began to seep into his consciousness. He saw glimpses of other cabins, other clearings, other humans like himself who had been chosen, observed, tested. The images were fleeting, fragmented like shattered glass, each shard reflecting moments of endurance, moments of comprehension, and moments where the human mind had failed under the weight of awareness. Dendru's presence was constant, a steady anchor, yet within the currents of thought he could feel the depth of its existence. The alien had moved silently among humans for decades, centuries perhaps, selecting those capable of perceiving what could not be explained. Each person carried potential, a latent ability to sense, to remember, to endure the incomprehensible. Some had resisted, their minds fracturing under the pressure, leaving echoes in the snow, in the forests, in the fabric of memory that Dendru preserved as evidence of trial and failure. Ethan could feel it now, the weight of that history pressing against his consciousness. He was not the first to be chosen, nor would he be the last. Yet there was something different, something singular about him that drew Dendru closer, that made the compulsion less a test and more a training. A guided passage, each symbol traced in snow, each step taken without conscious volition, each dream that had bled into reality, was part of a continuum stretching far beyond human comprehension. He began to understand that the world he had known, the life he had lived, had been only a fraction of possibility, a surface upon which greater truths could imprint. Images unfolded of other humans under Dendru's observation. A man standing in a desert, staring at stars that bent impossibly toward the horizon. A woman in a city, fingers tracing symbols in the sand as streetlights flickered unnaturally. All had been tested, All had been judged in subtle ways, yet the memory of success or failure was never theirs to keep. Dendru did not act out of malice, nor out of benevolence, but out of a purpose that transcended morality. The cultivation of perception, the endurance of mind and body, the recognition of latent capacity. Ethan felt a quiet awe, a trembling beneath thought. To be part of this lineage, this silent history, was both terrifying and exalted. The forest around him, the snow, the wind, even the cabin far behind him, were imbued with the residue of those who had come before, their traces preserved in patterns, symbols, and the weight of observation. Time, he realized, was not linear here. It was layered, overlapping, and he had stepped into one of the deepest currents of existence, where history, memory, and prescience converged. Dendru remained beside him, still, silent, radiating a presence that was patient yet immense. Ethan understood, without being told, that the trials were only beginning, that his endurance, his perception, and his capacity to witness would determine the next steps. The history of observation was now his history too, and the forest, the snow, and the light were no longer merely surroundings. They were instruments of a purpose older than human memory, older than himself, and entirely beyond escape. The forest had grown quiet in a way that was impossible, unnatural. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, caught between the trees, and the snow under Ethan's boots yielded no ordinary resistance. Every step carried the weight of observation, as though countless unseen eyes traced the movement of his body, the rhythm of his breathing, the flicker of thought across his mind. Dendru remained at his side, still and unblinking, radiating a calm that contrasted with the tension pressing from the shadows. Yet even the alien's presence could not mask the faint traces of others, entities moving in the periphery of reality, hidden yet perceptible. Ethan felt them first as whispers against perception, currents in the air that tugged subtly at awareness. They were not physical beings in the sense humans understood, but patterns of existence, watchers embedded within the forest, within the snow, within the very fabric of the world around him. Some seemed to observe him specifically, while others moved along trajectories he could not follow, glimpsed in the corner of thought and then gone. The network was vast, silent, patient, a lattice of consciousness older and more intricate than anything his mind could encompass. Dendru's mind pressed gently into his own, conveying without words the nature of these presences. They were not hostile, nor indifferent, but deeply intentional. The watchers had roles, positions, hierarchies imperceptible to human logic. Each was engaged in observing, recording, and assessing, and together they formed a structure of awareness that spanned not only the forest, but extended into time itself. Ethan realized that his compulsion, his enforced motion, and the symbols he had traced were all components of this network, interactions woven into a larger design beyond his comprehension. The forest responded subtly to their presence. Snow shifted against trees without wind. The light of the fading day bent strangely around branches, and the occasional shimmer at the edge of vision suggested forms just beyond perception. Every detail carried significance, though Ethan could not yet decode it. There was a rhythm to the network, a cadence that pulsed through the ground, through the air, through his own senses, linking him to Dendru and the unseen watchers. The more he attuned, the more the reality of the forest seemed to fold and stretch, revealing layers beneath layers, each populated by observation, consciousness, and intention. A sense of both insignificance and importance settled over him. He was a single node in a lattice of sentience far beyond human understanding, yet his awareness, his endurance, and his resonance mattered within the system. The watchers, though silent and hidden, had marked him, acknowledged him, and perhaps even waited for him to understand his place. The forest itself became a mirror, reflecting not what was, but what was perceived, observed, and assessed. Hours passed unmeasured. Ethan could no longer distinguish between the snow, the forest, or the watchers within it. Every motion, every thought, every pulse of perception was entwined with the network, and he sensed that Dendru's guidance was only a fragment of a far greater orchestration. Awareness, he realized, was the currency of this world, and he had been drawn into a system that measured, cataloged, and shaped not matter, but consciousness itself. The unseen eyes were everywhere, and for the first time, he understood that he was both observed and observing, both participant and witness, caught in a web whose edges were invisible and whose depth was infinite. The cabin seemed smaller than before, walls pressing in with an imperceptible weight that grew heavier with each passing hour. Every attempt to reach beyond its confines had failed. Phones lay inert, their screens blank and lifeless, as though the circuits themselves had been drained of potential. Radios emitted nothing but silence, a static void that mocked effort. The laptop, usually humming with activity, refused to recognize any network, its operating system frozen in a pause that felt deliberate. No calls went through, no messages were sent or received, and the outside world receded into impossibility. Ethan's isolation was total, yet the pressure of observation did not lessen. Dendru moved beside him with unchanging calm, a presence that was at once reassuring and profoundly unnerving. It did not need to speak. Its awareness reached into the space between thoughts, a gentle insistence that Ethan could not resist. The alien's gaze, or the impression of it, pressed at his consciousness, a constant reminder that solitude did not mean freedom. Being alone in the snowbound cabin was no longer equivalent to being unseen or unmonitored. The silence outside was deliberate, a barrier that ensured all attention remained focused, all perception channeled, all awareness captive. Hours passed, though the passage was difficult to measure. Time had begun to behave differently, stretching, contracting, folding in ways that made every second elastic. The snowfall outside continued uninterrupted, yet each flake seemed suspended, captured in a lattice of perception that was broader than the human mind could hold. Ethan tried to test the limits of isolation, picking up the radio again, speaking his name into the receiver, then dropping it to the floor in frustration when nothing responded. He attempted the cell phone, the laptop, even the old ham radio he had brought for emergencies, yet all obeyed an invisible command, remaining inert and mute. A creeping unease replaced simple frustration. This was no ordinary technological failure. It was a suppression of contact, a deliberate severance from all human connection. Every instinct in him screamed to reach for help, to call, to signal, to break free of this confinement. Yet each act was nullified before it could manifest. Even the simplest attempts to act independently were subtly hindered, as if the world itself had conspired to prevent outreach. The isolation became tangible, pressing against his body, his chest, his mind. Dendru's presence seemed to pulse with understanding, the alien's telepathic communication threading through Ethan's thoughts without interruption. There was no reprimand, no explanation, yet the reasoning was undeniable. The failure of contact was not accidental. It was necessary. Ethan's attention, his perception, his awareness must remain focused, unbroken by the distractions of ordinary life. The cabin, the snow, the unresponsive machines, all of it existed to channel him inward, to prepare him, to cultivate endurance in a space where isolation was total, where observation could be felt in every breath, every heartbeat, every pulse of thought. In the stillness, a subtle recognition emerged. The network of watchers, the unseen presences, the history that Dendru had shared, all of it converged into a singular lesson. Contact with the outside was not permitted because the outside was irrelevant. The only reality that mattered was the one being constructed observed and measured here, within the confines of snow, silence, and unyielding attention. To endure this, to perceive fully without distraction, was to step further into understanding, and to fail would mean losing the fragile thread that bound awareness to comprehension. Ethan understood this without words. The isolation was total, yet in that totality lay the purpose, the test, and the inescapable truth. The snow had softened outside, each flake suspended in the half-light. Yet the world inside the cabin seemed denser, heavier, as if reality itself had thickened. Ethan felt it first in his limbs. The subtle tremor of muscles no longer resisting instinctive motion. The slow alignment of thought and sensation with something that was no longer entirely his own. The resistance he had carried against Dendru's presence, the disbelief, the frantic attempts to maintain autonomy, began to dissolve. Acceptance seeped in quietly. A creeping inevitability that left no room for hesitation. Memories, fragmented and disjointed for so long, began to clarify. Moments he could not account for, hours of missing time, gestures he could not recall initiating, all of it slotted into a terrifyingly coherent sequence. His hand, lifting to trace symbols on the snow-streaked windows, the midnight walks through the forest, the compulsion to move and act with no conscious decision. These were not anomalies, accidents, or hallucinations. They were part of a larger orchestration, a pattern he had only just begun to perceive. The clarity was not comforting. It was vast, overwhelming, and it filled him with a sense of exposure he could not escape. Dendru remained silent, yet the alien's awareness suffused the room. Every twitch of thought, every flicker of emotion, was noted and acknowledged without commentary, without judgment. The presence was a constant pressure, a subtle insistence that demanded recognition. Ethan realized that this acceptance was not a surrender but a recognition of reality itself, an acknowledgement that the rules he had trusted, the boundaries of the self he had clung to, were incomplete. They had never encompassed the full measure of existence, and to resist now would be to deny what he could no longer ignore. Even the cabin responded to his submission. Light seemed to bend more fluidly across the walls. The faint hum of unseen energy grew perceptible, and the air itself carried the weight of observation. Outside, the forest pulsed with a quiet rhythm, each tree, each shadow, each drifting flake of snow resonating with unseen presences. Ethan sensed layers upon layers of awareness, traces of other observers, echoes of Dendru's own history, and hints of a broader network that stretched far beyond human comprehension. He understood, viscerally, that his compliance was only one node in a system that measured, assessed, and integrated every act of perception. Fear did not vanish, but it shifted. It was no longer the frantic terror of an intruder in the dark or the panic of lost time. It became a deep, prickling awareness, an acknowledgement of forces that could not be resisted, a recognition that understanding and endurance were inseparable from observation. Ethan's mind, once rigid with disbelief, now moved with a slow, deliberate pliancy, accepting the currents that carried him. Every memory, every action, every compulsion aligned with this new awareness, weaving into a pattern that was both personal and impossibly vast. In that acceptance, a singular clarity emerged. He knew that Dendru's choice was precise, deliberate, and inescapable. The missing time, the symbols, the walks, the compulsions, all were preparatory threads, and now he could see the loom. Acceptance was no longer a choice. It was inevitable. The reality he had once resisted now enveloped him fully, and with that enveloping came a profound and unsettling truth. He had never been alone, and he never would be. The Watchers, the forest, the snow, Dendru, and the hidden currents of awareness were all intertwined. To deny them would be impossible. To resist would be futile. To exist within their system required nothing less than full recognition and the surrender of certainty. The understanding that every act, thought, and perception was part of a design that far exceeded human comprehension. The sensation arrived without warning, a subtle pressure at the base of Ethan's skull, threading through his spine and settling behind his eyes. It was not pain, nor pleasure, nor a vibration recognizable by any human measure. It was recognition, a quiet signal that his body and consciousness were no longer entirely his own. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones, a faint hum that resonated with the air. The snow outside, the shadows in the corners of the cabin. Dendru remained still, a calm presence, yet the intensity of observation pressed on him in waves. Unspoken but undeniable. Ethan reached instinctively to touch the back of his neck, and the mark answered. It was invisible to the eye, but he knew it existed. A recognition, he realized, of connection, of alignment, of a responsibility that transcended ordinary comprehension. It was not a tattoo, not a scar, not a symbol drawn in ink or blood. It was embedded in the space between thought and sensation, in the fibers of awareness, a sign that he had been chosen, that he had been observed for a reason that he could not yet articulate. The weight of it made his pulse quicken. The cabin shifted subtly around him. Light from the snow outside bent differently, reflected differently, as if the world itself acknowledged the imprint. Each shadow seemed to pulse with meaning, each object resonating with a familiarity that had never been there before. The mark was more than a signal to others. It was a key to perception, a reminder that everything he had experienced, every compulsive movement, every symbol traced in snow or on glass, was part of an intricate design he had only glimpsed in fragments. Dendru communicated without speaking, thoughts layered in clarity and calm. "You are known, Ethan." The words did not reach his ears, but entered his mind as an undeniable certainty. You are chosen. Recognition does not imply understanding. Responsibility does not guarantee control. The alien's presence was patient, deliberate, waiting for him to internalize the truth without resistance. Ethan realized that the mark was as much a test as it was a connection. It would shape him, guide him, and perhaps judge him according to criteria beyond human logic. A strange exhilaration accompanied the unease. The mark created a resonance in his consciousness that allowed him to perceive subtle patterns he had missed before. Snowflakes drifting outside, light filtering through the trees. The rhythm of his own heartbeat all seemed to contain messages, signals, echoes of something vast and unseen. The network that Dendru had hinted at, the other humans who had been chosen, the hidden watchers embedded in the forest and the sky, all were threads in a web that now included him. Even in this revelation, comprehension remained incomplete. The mark was a beginning, not a conclusion. Ethan understood instinctively that he would carry it always, that it would alter how he moved, how he thought, how he perceived. It was not a gift, nor a curse, nor a mere identifier. It was a tether to a destiny that stretched beyond time, beyond place, beyond the ordinary human mind. The realization settled over him, heavy yet undeniable. He was no longer merely Ethan Walker. He had become something more, marked and observed, a node in a system of awareness that he could not yet fully see, a part of a design that would demand everything he could endure, perceive, and remember. The cabin felt smaller than before, its walls closer, the shadows denser, as if every corner had been infused with the presence that lingered even when it moved. Dendru no longer needed to speak, and neither did Ethan. The silence between them had grown heavy with understanding, a quiet anticipation that pressed against the chest like the weight of snow on the roof. The alien's form, still towering and silent, shimmered faintly in the low light, and Ethan sensed that the departure he had been resisting in thought had already begun in substance. Time had become pliable. Minutes stretched into hours and hours collapsed into moments. Ethan could feel it in the subtle pulse beneath his skin. a rhythm that was not his own, but that he could perceive, measure, and even follow if he allowed himself to surrender to it. Dendru moved closer, and the air changed. The temperature remained constant, the snow outside unchanged, yet every molecule seemed aware, conscious, responsive. Ethan understood that the departure was not merely a leaving of space, but a displacement of awareness, a recalibration of the world according to rules he could no longer name. Questions crowded his mind, but the answers were not given. Why had he been chosen? What was the purpose of the mark, the compulsions, the symbols, the walks, the dreams? The clarity he had gained in acceptance only deepened the mystery. Free will felt simultaneously intact and irrelevant, a paradox that twisted his perception of reality. Every decision he had made, every hesitation, every instinctive action, had been guided, observed, and measured. Yet it was his own, or at least, it had been, until now. Ethan's hands rested on the table, tracing invisible patterns in the grain of the wood. He felt a memory, not entirely his own, or perhaps a memory he had never lived but now remembered with certainty. Other humans had been chosen before him, fragments of awareness tethered across decades, each one tested, observed, and integrated into a network that stretched beyond the forest, beyond the stars, beyond comprehension. Dendru's eyes, impossibly dark and fathomless, met his, conveying more in a moment than words ever could. You will continue. The thought did not enter his mind. It was placed there, undeniable, a command wrapped in inevitability. The sense of emptiness arrived before the form moved. It was not fear, not grief, not loneliness, but the hollow awareness of absence yet to be defined. He knew that when Dendru departed, the cabin, the snow, the forest, and even his own body would be different. He would retain the mark, the resonance of connection, the memory of shared perception. Yet the form that had inhabited this space would vanish, leaving only the echo of observation. Every sense, every pulse, every memory would carry the imprint of that presence. Dendru did not move abruptly. The alien's departure was a slow unweaving, a deliberate withdrawal of energy and awareness, leaving subtle traces in the corners of perception. Ethan felt the air thrum in response, the snow outside glitter with unseen patterns, and his own consciousness expand, stretching beyond the limits he had known. He realized then that fate and free will were not opposites but layers, entwined in ways that could be perceived but never fully controlled. The departure was imminent, yet the connection, the responsibility, and the awareness would remain, invisible yet undeniable, marking him for a journey that had only just begun. The first morning after Dendru's departure was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Snow lay undisturbed outside the cabin, the wind absent. Yet the air was thick with presence. Ethan moved slowly, each step measured, as if he were navigating not only space but an invisible memory embedded in the floorboards. The cabin looked the same at first glance. The stove, the table, the chairs, the peeling corners of wallpaper, all ordinary, untouched by any physical force. Yet beneath the mundane, subtle anomalies persisted. A faint warmth lingered where Dendru had stood. A shimmer traced the edges of the window frame, almost imperceptible, as though reality itself remembered the presence. He approached the walls, eyes scanning for the symbols that had appeared days before. They were gone in the literal sense. No line of ink, no etching on wood or glass remained. Yet when he blinked, or when his gaze softened, impressions resurfaced like after-images, faint but undeniable. One symbol floated in the corner near the ceiling, fading in and out, pressing against the edge of perception. Another lingered in the frost on the window, a pattern of lines and curves that vanished when touched by thought. It was as though the cabin had absorbed them, storing their resonance rather than their form. Ethan touched the table. His hand met solid wood, Yet the memory of the pressure where Dendru had placed a finger remained in his mind, lingering in his bones. He could feel the connection, a subtle pull toward the forest outside, toward the rhythm of wind and snow that seemed to hum with intentionality. Every object, every shadow, every minor imperfection of the cabin carried an echo, a memory of the alien's movements. The awareness that Dendru had left behind was not threatening. It was expectant, patient, observing without eyes, knowing without voice. Attempts to rationalize failed. Logic, science, and experience could not explain the impressions on his consciousness, the resonance in the air, the faint hints of motion he could perceive at the edge of vision. Phones remained dead. Radios remained silent. Computers flickered but offered nothing. The outside world was unreachable, yet the cabin vibrated with a presence that suggested connection to something vast, unseen, and ongoing. It was as though Dendru had not departed entirely, leaving behind a network of signals for Ethan to sense, interpret, and perhaps follow. The feeling of being observed intensified at moments when he was alone. In the kitchen, he noticed a faint alignment in the arrangement of objects. The coffee mug, the stack of firewood, even the chairs seemed to mark invisible coordinates, subtle guides pointing toward patterns he could not yet comprehend. He realized the traces were not proof for anyone else. They were meant solely for him. Evidence, in the conventional sense, could never capture what had occurred, but the impressions were indelible in his consciousness. Ethan sank into the chair by the window, staring out at the forest. Snowflakes drifted silently, each reflecting a fragment of light in patterns he could almost understand. A sense of continuity persisted, a reminder that even though Dendru was gone, something remained. The cabin, the snow, the wind, even his own body, carried traces of the encounter. Subtle but inescapable, the world outside had returned to ordinary time, ordinary space. But he knew he had been irrevocably altered. The marks were not visible to anyone else, yet they pulsed in his mind, a silent network of awareness that would guide him long after the presence had vanished from sight. The stillness of the cabin was no longer quiet. It vibrated with meaning, a resonance that pulsed through the floorboards and wrapped around Ethan like a current in the air. He had expected absence, a hollow emptiness where Dendru had departed. Yet what remained was far heavier, denser, a presence that pressed against thought and memory. Every breath he drew seemed measured, deliberate, as though the air itself carried instruction. And then the truth began to unfold, slow and unbearable in its clarity, like a tide pulling him deeper into understanding. He realized the selection had never been arbitrary. The cabin, the snow, the forest, even the compulsion to follow, to watch, to endure everything, had been orchestrated to reveal the extent of perception, the depth of endurance, the capacity to comprehend beyond normal human limits. He was chosen not for who he was on the surface, but for what lay beneath, the unseen architecture of his consciousness, the layers of mind and instinct that could be opened, tested, stretched, and connected to a larger network of awareness. Images pressed into his mind without warning, worlds beyond human sight, civilizations that existed as thought and energy rather than matter, all observing, all connected in an intricate lattice of knowledge and vigilance. He saw Dendru among them, not as an individual, but as a node in a system spanning galaxies and eons, tasked with monitoring, guiding, and sometimes catalyzing human potential. The weight of understanding was suffocating and exhilarating, a combination of awe, terror, and revelation that left his body trembling despite stillness. The realization struck with an almost physical force. Humanity was blind in ways no one could articulate, lost in repetition, obsession, and fragility, unaware of its own role in a universe that measured consciousness, not power or technology. He had been chosen because he could perceive, because he could withstand, because he could integrate the incomprehensible into a coherent thread without breaking. The mark Dendru had left was more than connection. It was a key, a catalyst, a call to awareness that could not be reversed, a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. Time no longer flowed conventionally. Moments layered atop one another, merging memory and experience into a tapestry he could read. Even as the edges frayed with incomprehensible detail, the forest outside shimmered faintly in his peripheral vision, a boundary between ordinary perception and the network he had glimpsed. He understood now that even when alone, he was not alone. Observation, influence, guidance, these forces threaded through existence, subtle but unyielding, and he was now part of them. Ethan felt transformation settle into his mind and body, a permanent alignment with something larger, something terrifying and magnificent. Dendru's departure was not absence but release, a passage from ignorance into an awareness that humanity was not ready to confront. He could not speak it aloud. No one could. To articulate the truth would shatter understanding, and yet the certainty burned in him like a beacon. Immutable, undeniable. The snow outside continued to fall, blanketing the world in deceptive normality. Yet Ethan no longer walked within normal bounds. He understood the weight of perception, the responsibility of endurance, and the depth of consciousness beyond matter. He was forever altered, alone, and connected simultaneously, carrying a truth that stretched across space and time, a truth that humanity was not yet ready to face. The cabin remained quiet on the surface, but inside, within him, a vast universe had awakened, and the reason he had been chosen was now both terrifying and luminous, unending in its revelation.